Live.
Distinguished guests, good afternoon. I'm really delighted to open this event organized in cooperation with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center. My deepest thanks to all the distinguished guests who will participate in the panel, which is part of a cycle of virtual events co-organized ahead of the 6th edition of the Rome-Med Dialogue held from November 25th in an entirely digital format. Navigating solutions for post-pandemic times will be the central theme of this year's edition of our conference, not only because the Rome-Med Dialogue cannot retract from analyzing the harsh reality caused by the virus, but also because we have the little ambition to offer some solution, some idea on this terrible challenge while remaining a relevant forum to reimagine the future of the region. So far, Med has responded to the uncertainty and challenges posed by COVID through a long list of virtual panels that have fostered broader discussion among experts and policymakers, flourishing into a really true year-long initiative we started in March. Today's webinar reinforces, and I'm pleased to underline, the long-standing cooperation between ISPI and Carnegie Middle East in shedding light on the most pressing issue regarding the broader Mediterranean and the Middle East. I wish to thank my friend Maha and everyone at the center for joining ISPI in organizing this event in such a difficult moment for Lebanon, a country which deserves greater attention and support from all of us. Now, I yield the floor to you, Maha.
Thank you, Paolo. It's always a pleasure to be joining a platform with you. And as you said, it's been actually a wonderful partnership over the last few years, and I'm looking to many more moving forward. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Valeria and the rest of the ISPI team for the amazing work that they do. And to my dear friends on this panel for joining us today and what promises to be a very timely and interesting discussion. As you all know, Lebanon is going through a massive, or we used to say a triple crisis, now it's quadruple or multiple crises at the same time, an economic, a financial one, a political one, and now a health crisis. The situation is deteriorating exponentially. There is a political deadlock in the country today. The current government resigned more than a month and a half ago, and there still is no new government in sight, despite a French initiative to push for the formation of a new government of independents who also know what they're doing, people who can come in and enact the necessary reforms, particularly on the economic and financial side, in order to steer the country out of the current abyss it finds itself in. That government has not materialized, in part because the elite continues in a business as usual model. The current infighting is really about who gets to take over which portfolio. Meanwhile, the economic situation is such that the Lebanese lira, the local currency, has lost close to 70% of its value. Poverty rates are more than 50% of the population. The middle class is disappearing completely. There's a mass exodus of, I think there was an article recently, close to 1,500 doctors have left the country. This is in the middle of a pandemic and a major health crisis. The infrastructure is crumbling. More than 200,000 people are said to have lost their jobs. The situation is truly dire. In a country where the normal social protection mechanisms that would be provided by the state are simply not there. What we do have are political parties / former militias that are poised, and political leadership that are poised and are still both holding on to power, trying to minimize the losses to themselves in terms of the economic losses to themselves, don't want to yield any ground, and that are trying to figure out a way where they can even use this tragedy to support themselves. And this, I haven't mentioned the Beirut port explosion, which to my mind is probably the best expression of the level of criminal negligence that some of this political leadership has shown. Today with me on this panel, I'm sharing the podium with three wonderful colleagues. Randa Slim, who is at the Middle East Institute. Sorry, I'm trying to open up my, okay. Randa Slim, who is at the Middle East Institute, and she is the senior fellow and the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Ishac Diwan, who is the chair, chair at the Sciences in Paris, at the Sciences et Lettres, and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, Chaire d'Excellence. And then Dorothée Schmid, who is a senior fellow and head of Turkey and the Middle East program at the French Institute of International Relations. Today, we're going to begin with the headline of the moment, which is a kind of a commentary a little bit to get the views of our different panelists on the big picture consequences of the US election. So Randa, I'm going to start with you. Can you please tell us a bit more about what we can expect from the upcoming Biden presidency for the region and then perhaps for Lebanon as well?
Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for the US audience. It's a pleasure really to be today with the wonderful colleagues here, and thank you for ISPI and for Med and for the Carnegie Malcolm Kerr Middle East Center for the invitation. So, so Biden is inheriting, President-elect Biden is going to be inheriting on January 20 at noon, a divided country. You know, the US elections definitely showed there is a high still level of support for Mr. Trump, although the popular vote for Mr. Biden is higher by 5-some million votes than President Trump. But it shows definitely a divided country, but also a world that is increasingly in disarray because of a number of global crises. The pandemic on one hand, the economic challenges resulting from the pandemic, climate change, diffusion of power away from states, increasing governance challenges within state institutions, not only in the US, but also around the world. So domestic priorities, given where we are today in the US, will be taking a lot of President-elect Biden's time and administration as soon as they assume office. I think the priority of containing an out of control right now epidemic. We have, last week alone, we had 1 million new cases. I think we are at or close to get to 250,000 of COVID-19 deaths in the United States. People are expecting a dark winter. Experts are expecting a dark winter, saying number of deaths from COVID could reach 400,000 by January, which is like really an awful scenario. And then he has to focus on containing the epidemic. He has to focus on, now that there are vaccines, on safe distribution of the vaccine, and he has to focus on jumpstarting the US economy. So the Middle East, based on what many of his advisors have said, is not going to be a high priority region for the incoming Biden administration. As his senior foreign policy advisor, Mr. Blinken, said last July at the Hudson Institute, in terms of both budget allocation and budget priorities and time allocation for the Biden administration, the Biden administration will be doing less and not more in the Middle East. This does not mean that the Middle East will not find a way to impose itself on a US presidential agenda, as we have seen in the past. So what we expect, I think the way to to look at incoming US administration policies in the Middle East is to look at it through big headlines. One is one objective of the Biden administration in general is to restore historic partnership with allies, especially in Europe and Asia. And especially when it comes to European countries, I think the Middle East as a region is a shared interest. And so we expect that would be on the agenda of the discussions between a Biden administration and European allies in terms of how to restore this relationship, where to focus restoring this relationship on. Middle East could be one of them. The second big headline is Iran. I mean, President-elect Biden has promised that if Iran were to recommit to its obligation, strictly commit to its obligation per the 2015 JCPOA deal, Iran, the US would also commit to its obligation, would join the deal. And the question is, what kind of damage will be done by the Trump administration between now and January 20? I mean, Secretary Pompeo and acting special rep for Iran, Mr. Abrams, have already promised weekly sanctions on Iran between now and January 20. So by the time they assume office, despite their promises, I think they might be facing a very, big basket of sanctions, some of which could be reversed, could be lifted, because they have been issued by executive order. The problem is going to be the political cost domestically of lifting these sanctions, especially if the US Senate were to remain in Republican hands going forward. Although I have to say here that I think foreign policy is one area where Mr. President-elect Biden and even the Republican senators will find some convergences. In fact, if we look at areas where Senate Republicans during the Trump administration went publicly against President Trump, was on foreign policy. I mean, President Trump is an outlier when it comes to US relationship with its allies, with US, role in international institution, US role in international organization. So Iran will be the second headline. And then the other major challenge is that by the time the Biden administration comes in, which is January, and then you have the Iranian presidential election in May, so there is a very tight time frame. And then will that opportunity be able to be mined by both sides if there is a willingness? Remember, there is an anniversary coming up, 3rd of January, which is the killing of Qasem Soleimani. That makes many security analysts in this country worried. And then, Iran still has vowed to avenge the murder of Soleimani. So what can happen even before President-elect Biden assumes office is going to be important on that. And that might constrict options on Iran. The third headline is ending forever wars. This is a very it's an area of agreement between the different wings in the Democratic Party, the moderates on one hand and the progressive on the other. And then you are going to see, which is very much similar to the Trump administration, a US administration pushing for drawing down its forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq, limiting its military footprint in the region. The question is, they want to do that, spend less time and less money, and yet they want to retain influence in the region. And that's going to be the challenge for the Biden administration, how to retain influence when you are not expending as many resources, even time-wise, on the region. And finally, we are going to expect a value shift, re-emphasis on human rights, priorities, and for President-elect Biden, and that has been an important issue for him for a long time, even during the Obama administration and before that, is the emphasis on corruption. He looks at corruption, and he has written about that as corroding, the international order, corroding human dignity. And so you are going to see more of a push by the Biden administration on human rights in its dealings with different countries in the Middle East, particularly with Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and also on the issue of corruption, and that will impact Lebanon. I will stop here because I think we can have more time for Lebanon later.
Sorry, this is actually where I wanted to kind of use it as a segue before I move to Dorothée to ask about EU policy. Is maybe you can come in with a few words on what that means for Lebanon. We just saw the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gibran Bassil, indicted or sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act, which is very much about corruption and not about terrorism. So do you see more of this? I mean, how do you see a shift to, there is the interim period between now and January 21st, but I think our main concern is after January 21st, how will all of this impact Lebanon, where Lebanon, I think, is not even a blip on the foreign policy agenda of the United States? Just very briefly, Renda, before we move to
I totally agree with you. There is an existential crisis in Lebanon, but I don't think it meets the threshold of a crisis for the incoming US administration, the threshold of basically rising up in attention and time allocation for the incoming Biden administration. I think what we're going to see in Lebanon going forward with the Biden administration, very much a continuation of the so in a way, it's not totally, as the title of the panel said, it's not totally out with the old, so part of the old will remain, and it's not totally new because some of it will new, but not all of it will be new. So I think Lebanon will continue, like with the Trump administration, to be viewed as a subset of other major regional issues with that are of importance, primarily Iran, but also Syria. We are going to see by the administration re-engaging diplomatically on Syria, and that will have implication for Lebanon and for Hezbollah. Of the East Med gas, this is an old issue for going all the way back to the Obama administration, and of course it's an important for the Trump administration. But also I think part of this file that the Trump administration introduced, which is normalization of relations between Israel and Arab countries, and so you are going to see a push on on the ongoing indirect negotiation between Israel and Lebanon maritime-wise on the maritime borders. And in fact, you are going to see also a continued interest in a file that the Trump administration has been, has paid a lot of attention, which is release of US hostages from Syria. And so, whatever parties in Lebanon can help on this file, I think will get US attention, and US officials, how to say,
if they don't get sanctioned in the interim.
yes. Sanction. Look, I don't think a lot of the. I don't think sanctions when it comes to Lebanon will be lifted, but I don't think sanctions will be the only means by which the US will exercise its foreign policy in Lebanon.
No, I agree. No, I completely agree. What I meant was, unless some of these figures who are helping out with these files don't get sanctioned in the interim between now and January 21st by the current administration.
Oh yeah. Don't know
what's different. Now and then. Don't know what will happen. Dorothée, let's me move to you and ask you about the EU's role. How is the EU's role in the region today compared to other regional global players? And will that role change in light of the Biden presidency? Do you see a greater push, a greater engagement, less engagement? How do you see things moving forward from the EU front? And I will be coming back to ask you also the Paris Initiative in a short while.
Yeah. I always have the feeling that this question about the EU's role is a bit rhetoric, but and the other problem is, like, when I'm asked to
in a sense
answer as a French analyst, I feel completely biased because France has been extremely active, especially Emmanuel Macron, very active in advocating for a more strategic role of the EU, the building of a European defense policy and capacity, and so. The first thing probably to recall is that the EU is becoming more and more fragmented over a series of issues. And although I think we within the EU, different member states share priorities. We do not necessarily reconcile on the tactics, the outlook, the means that have to be deployed, etc. But the first thing is to say is that, of course, the election of Biden provided us with an immense sense of relief. I was absolutely amazed at how seriously the election was followed in France. It was like a matter of life and death, absolutely. Like people, of course, we're under lockdown, so we can spend hours and hours in front of our TVs, but we are sort of really suspended to the results of the elections in America. But this is combined with a very strong sense of disillusionment. I think there is a lot of deception vis-a-vis the America. And the day after when the results started to sort of clearly, legally lean in favor of Biden, you could see lots of op-eds going out saying, asking the EU not to, I would say, not to give up on their effort for strategic autonomy, especially in France, thinking about the world without the United States and saying that, in fact, things will never be the same. Like the Trump administration has just followed on a track that had been set by his predecessors, and that since even the Obama administration, the willingness of Washington to withdraw from theaters where they think they're not being rewarded for any efforts, or their presence is counterproductive, or that it backfires at the internal situation in the US. So there is the idea that America wants to retreat from the world, or to probably to focus on other regions, and then we'll be left with the Middle East. And clearly, the assessment is that our priorities in the region are different from the American ones, and there is a sense of transatlantic divergence. And this also adds to the fragmentation that I was alluding to within the EU, because there we see the divide growing between the French and the Germans. As you know, Germany is a much more Atlanticist nation. They do rely a lot, they do trust a lot the United States in providing the strategic safety for Europe. And the French do not necessarily share this assessment, this vision, this outlook. And we see this growing on specific files, I would say. And Lebanon is probably one of the issues where we saw there was a feeling in France that French effort had been undermined by some action from the Trump administration, and there has always been some latent competition between the French and other administration in Libya. And I'm not only talking about the Italians or within the EU, but also there was some dissatisfaction in Washington with some French trying to make their way into organizing peace talks in Libya that were thought to be totally untimely, etc. So what can we hope for in the future? And I see when some analysts are thinking about how to what the role of the EU will be with the Middle East. The idea is like we have to deal with it because there might be a division of labor. The US focusing more on going more Pacific, focusing on Asia, and we'll have to do MENA. And then what our priorities are we have, of course, economic priorities like securing energy supplies, and the high prices of energy do really disadvantage the EU currently. But then we have some very specific priorities with migration and refugees. And the latest new alert was with Islamist radicalism. I mean, the latest attacks in Europe, especially in France, especially as big, we're just coming into the second lockdown. There's a sort of paranoia that's building up into this Macron discourse about Islam being a religion in the crisis, separatism in France, fighting Islamist radicalism at home, but also in the world. And we see that we are being weakened by a sort of psychological isolation that's growing under, I'd say, COVID-19, COVID conditions currently. So I think, in a nutshell, I'm not very optimistic, because I think we will have to cope with more and more difficulties in our neighborhood, MENA-wise, and the EU is not well equipped. Institutionally, it's not well equipped. I don't think necessarily we have the economic resource either. We have clearly a lack of strategic outlook and capacities, and I'm really worried about the dispersion of European efforts, and especially what I feel as the growing divide between France and Germany in the way we should look at the region strategically.
Let me unmute. Okay, here we are. Thank you, Dorothée. Can I ask you, before I move to Ishac, can I ask you maybe to say a few words in this broader context about the French initiative specifically towards Lebanon? I mean, you've highlighted the schisms within an EU general policy between the different, as you said, which EU. Can you say maybe a bit more about the French initiative and where it is and what you see coming out of it?
So that's a big topic, of course. It's a big box.
It's a very big box.
And there's a lot to say. And actually, as I was preparing this session, I tended, like, I think some French analysts, to be overcritical of Macron's efforts, especially because there's a sense that he failed. I mean, on the short term, he failed. But I think he should be given credit for trying. And I think he will be given credit for trying, because nobody wanted to try, in fact. And the idea is that French felt legitimate at the same time for historical reasons, but also because Macron has, I think, he's building now a sort of, he has a strategic mindset about the Middle East. He's been everywhere this summer. He's been at Libya, Lebanon, Iraq, the East Med. So he thought it could not stay out of what happened in Lebanon. But what to us in France seemed sort of completely alien is we had seen the president struggling with the COVID-19 crisis inside France, with a constant, contest that they were not competent, that they were completely sort of drowned into the social difficulties here. They could not impose any solution. They had no idea, no clue about what to do. And then suddenly Macron comes out of the box and travels to Lebanon twice, and he looks, super in shape, and he's so triumphant. And then everybody was looking at that with very a lot of incredulity. Like, we could not believe it. What were they doing? But very quickly, there was this old French reflex within the larger public. I'm not talking only about Middle Eastern specialists in France, that actually it's totally legitimate that we try to find a solution for Lebanon, because, as was said there was a long analysis by a journalist in Le Monde, quoting Henri Laurence, who's a very famous academic, saying that Lebanon is no stranger to France, that Lebanese are no foreigners to France, like we're the same people, basically. So strangely enough, we had this president who started to be hyperactive diplomatically just after this moment of the complete suspension of international relations with the COVID-19 in the spring. And then we wonder why he went to Beirut twice, and then everybody agrees, okay, you can do that. There's complete trust that he will find something, he will manage something. And then he sort of fails, but he does not completely fail, because actually he exposed the problem. I mean, he clearly set out the roadmap publicly, and which is something that was completely, I think, useful, in fact, and to make public that we know the problem is with the corruption, clientelism, old style politics in Lebanon. Now there is this economic crisis. We knew that Lebanon was collapsing economically, but now there's this new political crisis. So you have, guys, you will have to do these reforms, but then you have to be serious at it. Okay, this used to be discussed in very close circle. I mean, who knows about what was discussed within the Cedre conference? Who knows about Cedre? And Cedre is something that the French organized, that they engineered. I don't mean that they manage to do it, but at least I think their role is probably to try and convince everyone to come together to find a solution. Now, I think the next step, because I know that what's been reproached to the French, and that was one of the questions that was asked preparing this panel, is do French efforts actually come out with what the EU has to do, and Josep Borrell saying that Lebanese civil society has to self-determine and decide, the Lebanese have to decide for themselves. But I mean, there was a call from some Lebanese from outer intervention and from outer help. It's only that I think France is not on the right scale. You cannot separate, of course, geopolitics from economy in Lebanon. And Macron tried to solve the situation in a very technocratic way. I think he failed at the same time because probably he was advised by people who are very old school, people who were used to how Lebanon functioned like maybe 10 years ago, or who did not actually took the seriously enough the degradation of the situation for the last, I say, 2 years, especially the economic side and the social side of it. So we have, the old view of Lebanon. We had a very technocratic approach, clearly, and we overestimate the relevance of our strategic capacity, whereas you cannot compartmentalize. I mean, of course, Iran is difficult to, keep out of the picture even when you discuss technocratic reforms in Lebanon. And then the last problem is that Macron probably communicates too much. Like he wanted to be really praised for what he did. He wanted it to be a sort of public relations victory. And in that regard, he failed. I'm not sure France failed for the rest completely.
Thank you, Dorothée. And I tell you, from the Lebanese perspective, his initiative was very welcome. And it did push a dialogue, because up until that point, there was no dialogue on any front. Literally, I mean, the bottleneck between the leadership was very much there and very much in viewed. Now we can talk about the initiative at a later stage as to what could have been done right or done differently. But let me now take the opportunity, since we started talking about the economy, to move to Ishac and ask you, Ishac.
Maha,
yes?
Can I say a word?
Yes, of course.
Would you allow me? No, because I think, can I comment on what Dorothée said for a second? If
yes,
you allow
of course.
me. Excuse me, Isaac, 1 second. No, because I think Europe is blessed by having France, a very active France, taking initiative with in a brave way in many different areas of the world. We had Sarkozy in Georgia many years ago, and we have now Macron jumping on a plane immediately after the crisis and taking initiative. But I wonder if this helps avoiding that your question at the beginning, what's the European position, looks rhetoric all the time. because this, I mean, on one side, there is a need for dynamism and someone breaking schemes and taking a plane. On the other side, does that help any kind of cohesive position of Europe? In short, if I were Borrell, how would I consider my position when the French president gets on a plane, even before I have the time to, not even to gather a European meetings, but to call on the phone a couple of leaders, Macron and Merkel. Let's put that as at the minimum level. So great thing to have France, great news. The more we have France, the less we can ask to your question without being rhetoric or considering your question a rhetoric question. Sorry for the interruption.
No, just one.
No,
one minute, just to say that I fully agree with you, and I was absolutely. I was very disappointed that Macron did not do the first visit to Lebanon with some European leaders, either from the EU or from some member states. And I think he should have done that. It would have, helped him enormously politically afterwards also.
Just to add on this, before I turn to Ishac, I think there are two things we need to remember. His first visit was the second day after the massive explosion that literally destroyed half of Beirut and displaced more than 6,500 people were injured, 300,000 people were displaced. So there was a moral support element to it for the Lebanese that was tremendous. To have someone coming in, an international leader coming in and basically checking in at a time when the local leadership had disappeared. So I think that's important. Now, the calculus for it, it's a different story, but I think we need to keep that in that at least keep that context in place. My sense of the EU policy at this point, and I think this is something for another panel, perhaps, or merits a lot more discussion, is that it seems to be for several years now, the kind of minimum, let's take the lowest common denominator. So there's consensus on the need to provide and support on the humanitarian front in Lebanon and Syria and other places, but there is no consensus on how to move forward politically in a number of areas. So it is really very much, at least in certain areas, the kind of minimum common denominator. Anyway, not to dwell, we can do another panel on this, Paolo. I think it does merit a longer discussion, particularly when it comes to the region, to Syria, and to other places. But let me move to Ishac, finally, who's been waiting very patiently to talk about basically the economic file. What, in your view, can the new administration do about Lebanon's economic woes? And also in light of the discussion we just heard on the role of the EU, the general, actually global downturn even. And do you think the new administration will have an impact on IMF negotiations, or is the bottleneck really very much internal? It continues to be internal.
Okay.
There we are. Big questions.
Yeah,
and thank you for waiting.
Welcome. I mean, good to be on the panel with you, with Maha, Dorothée, and Randa. I want to build on what you said. I mean, clearly, a more engaged U.S. policy that start trying to solve problems in Lebanon, in Iran, in particular, reducing tensions with Iran and Saudi Arabia, working together with Europe more closely, trying to also re-engage in Syria, maybe stop the war in Yemen, can only have positive impact in Lebanon if that was to happen. If I put that in the context of the Macron initiative, I mean, the way I understand the Macron initiative is really an attempt to focus first on the house burning, which is the economy collapsing, and try to put politics aside for a moment, neutralize the political pressures and tensions to be resolved later on, focusing first on the fire. And really the reason it failed is that he couldn't neutralize the politics. The region is too polarized. Hezbollah is too eager to be part of the government in order not to be attacked through kind of saving the economy. That proved impossible. But I think the basic structure that Macron put together makes a lot of sense. It's trying to put all the political leaders around the table, agree on the minimum that needs to be done, and then hire a technocratic government to do it. He failed on the second front because the government could not be technocratic, and what Saad Hariri is trying to do now again is to put together a wealth sharing arrangement which has failed in the past to reach any of these tough decisions that need to be taken. So in which ways could this new international environment help Lebanon? I think really in three ways. First, in terms of the key challenge of the country is to stabilize the economy. And the difficulty is to absorb the huge losses that need to be absorbed. Incomes falling, wages, imports, and wealth also having to adjust. Huge debt reductions are needed. Debts are about 3 times current GDP. And it's important to realize those are mostly internal debts. And so reducing those debts to make the state solvent again, to reopening the banking sector, involves domestic creditors accepting debt reduction. So it's a very difficult challenge. And to help that challenge, providing liquidity support would ease that burden in the short term. And the IMF alone cannot do it because Lebanese quota are rather small. So if we can think of a coalition that this new environment would allow, and I'm being optimistic now, with the GCC, with the US, with Europe, together around the IMF, perhaps some kind of a construction led by France and Europe, that will provide a more serious environment for those mega stabilization efforts. And I think the Macron bet, which is to isolate politics for a while, leave it for later, neutralize the Hezbollah issue in particular, which couldn't work because the US and Pompeo in particular did not allow that to work. Within a cooperative solution, that becomes more possible. And that is necessary for any solution. I mean, I would say, no optimistic scenario can happen without coordinated external support. At the same time, I would end by saying nothing will work without internal coordination and internal solidarity. And the hope is that with reduced regional and international tension, that becomes more possible. But these are issues we'll come back to a little bit later.
All right, thank you, Ishac. I'm going to come back to Randa with a couple of questions on Lebanon before we come back on the economic issues as well. Randa, if I can come back to you and ask you a little bit, and actually as I'm asking the question, I'm going to also weave in a question from our audience, is in the complex equation that you've already outlined at the beginning, what is your assessment of the Hezbollah variable? What are the expected US talking points in whatever upcoming discussions or negotiations with Iran that may come up? And is there a role for Lebanon? Well, we'll come back to this in terms of a role for Lebanon to address some of the structural issues. And here, if you could also comment a little bit about on the maritime discussions, delineations, particularly because in trying to understand what the delineations mean, not only on the political front, but also possible economic use down the road.
Yeah, in terms of Iran, what President-elect Biden promised is a credible path to Iran back to negotiation, but on the condition that Iran will recommit to its obligations. And we have seen the latest IEA report in terms of the European stockpile, where it is, the low-enriched uranium stockpile, which will need time, time to be processed into bomb-grade material. But now the expectation is Iran is, by spring, it can have access, it can have a nuclear weapon. And so we have seen also reports from by the New York Times yesterday of the Trump administration and President Trump himself now asking for options, of what to do to scale back that nuclear program. Supposedly he has been, advised, or he has been persuaded by his advisors not to engage in any kind of military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, particularly Natanz. But we don't know again until 2020. I think with terms with Hezbollah, look, also what President-elect has said, that they don't want to, if they were to enter into negotiation with Iran, if there is this opportunity that avails itself, they just don't want to go back to where Secretary Kerr, left the deal with. I mean, remember, a lot of these officials who are coming with President-elect also were part of the team that negotiated the 2015 JCPOA deal. And there have been lessons learned from that experience. And so these lessons learned are in a way coloring their approach to Iran. And their approach to Iran is now saying, yes, we want to, to revive or rejoin, the JCPOA 2015 deal, but on condition that it will lead to something better, and President-elect Biden said, we need to use this platform, this negotiation platform, if it avails itself, to address other issues that, concerns the US and concern US allies vis-a-vis Iran, particularly its ballistic missile program and its regional destabilizing behavior in the region. And herein comes Hezbollah. So I think Hezbollah will be put on the agenda. And that's going to complicate the nuclear negotiation, because as any person who has led negotiation knows, once you start piling up issues, and it makes negotiations extremely difficult. And so I'm not sure that we will be able to revive the 2015 nuclear deal if all these other issues are put on the table, but it looks like the Biden team would like to put these other issues on the table. And it could be a matter of sequencing, we start with the nuclear, rejoin, and then move into strengthening the nuclear deal, especially in terms of its sunset clauses, and then, put the other issues on the table, destabilizing behavior. Hezbollah. I don't think Hezbollah will get a pass. The Biden team has made it clear that the approach to Hezbollah will not be different from the Trump administration approach to Hezbollah. The difference is going to be in what are the means to implement these policies. So it's going to be, again, less sanctions, but also more diplomatic engagement with Lebanon to deal, internally with this issue. It's going to be a tough going for Lebanon, in my opinion. And whatever Lebanon will require from the US will need time for the US to get its diplomatic somehow, game going on Lebanon. And that's going, I don't know if, Lebanon can afford the time. And that's going to be the issue, that with this administration, eventually it will get its act, on Lebanon, but it's going to require a lot of time, and it's going to require a lot of diplomatic capital. And that's where the EU, France comes in, in terms of creating opportunities for the US to up its game diplomatically on Lebanon going forward. On the maritime border negotiations, I think these are going to be dragged. My feeling about, and that's my perspective. Maha, you are in the country, you are a better judge of what this is going to be. I think this was the decision by Hezbollah to lift its veto, and there was a veto. Remember, the framework for this negotiation was agreed upon in 2019, when at the time Assistant Secretary David Satterfield was doing this negotiation between Lebanon, indirect, shuttle diplomacy between Lebanon and Israel. The framework that was announced recently by Mr. Berry, which allowed the negotiation to start, was agreed upon in 2019. It took all this time because there was a Hezbollah veto. It got lifted. And in my opinion, it got lifted basically to dangle a carrot to the Trump administration, awaiting the US elections and hopefully a Biden, presidency in the future.
Thank you, Randa. Dorothée, let me move back to you on the same question on Hezbollah. Even though we've said there is no clear which EU are we talking about, but will the policy towards Hezbollah remain more or less the same moving forward, or do you see a shift on that particular file? And how will that impact possible, or will it impact possible support for Lebanon on the economic front?
Unmute. I just realized this week we are running into a new problem with Hezbollah, because there was an official announcement that the France position on secularism and the defense of freedom of expression has been condemned officially by Hezbollah, because the French president is considered as encouraging the sort of very conflictual position and affront to the the prophet. So you have to realize that President Macron himself, Macron's team does not necessarily have a dovish attitude vis-à-vis Iran and the Hezbollah. Macron himself seemed to be more probably of a diplomat or an optimistic. He has great confidence in his ability to, change the course of history. That stems probably from what he did conquering the power in France, actually, completely, surging out of nowhere and seizing power as an extremely young and energetic man. And he has the same attitude on the international stage. So he's not badly disposed vis-a-vis Iran and the Hezbollah. But in his team, the bulk of his team is filled with people who come from the more kind of neoconservative trend within the French diplomacy and the military. So they do not believe in the Iranian regime's ability to change from within. They do not believe in social reform coming from economic openness, etc. So, and lately, we have seen a sort of U-turn of Macron on these questions of religion, where he used to be really much more relaxed, extremely more possibilista, as we say in Italian. Like he was able to see what were the shortcomings of the French society when some fighters who went to Syria and Iraq and coming back, like what's our responsibility with this, etc. So now he's come to a much more essentialistic position, and he has become much more strictly aligned with the idea of fighting Islamic terrorism, because as I said before, Islam has to be reformed. It's a sort of much more universalistic, occidentalistic, westernized, culturalist approach to it. So I don't think this actually, we should not expect France's attitude, at least, to become more open to dialogue with the Hezbollah in the Lebanese context. Especially as now, and I see there was one question actually on the chat as how Macron can how can he afford to talk to Saad Hariri again and to bring the Hariri family again. So that was another thing that actually Macron had to swallow. That was not his intention at all. So if they have to do with all these sort of enormous constraints, like the big players have become again the Hezbollah and Hariri, who wants to show that he can flex his muscle vis-a-vis Hezbollah because he wants to regain support from the Saudis or whatever. So I think the attitude by now from the French diplomatic team is like, okay, let them settle their accounts by themselves. We've done what we can. We're not endorsing fully any side, and we hope that they will neutralize each other in some way. So as far as Europe is concerned, that's quite different, because of course I see, especially working with the Germans in the series of partnerships, that there is a willingness to be much more normative in the way they deal with countries in the region, like setting principles all the time. And it's extremely difficult to bring a European consensus on the type of principles that have to be set, especially because the French would not necessarily agree with this principled approach, because I think it might be counterproductive practically. And I do not think it's extremely effective, this principled approach, but I think it'll be very difficult to avoid this in the future because of the terror attacks that we've had again lately in Vienna, and because of the big fear that we see now developing in Europe on how to sort of control what we perceive as external interferences by states in the Middle East on Muslim communities, if they exist, if you can characterize any community by their religion. Okay. So I think it would be very difficult to maintain a more open, possibilist, and more diplomatic approach. And I don't think the balance will be easy to strike. And anyway, in the end, the Americans have the upper hand on this. And that's another remark I wanted to do, because the French have been talking about sanctions here and there. You realize that the big role, there was a public quarrel there was between Macron and Georges Malbruno in Beirut. If you remember the big press conference and Macron yelling at the French journalist because he'd been disclosing that the French thought of sanctioning actually Hariri. The French have been playing with the idea of sanctions because to them, I think it's the instruments of big players, because it's the Americans who do impose sanctions. So in the end, it's always like we're bluffing, we're thinking of sanctions, but we'll never do it because we don't have the capacity to impose it, to have it respected, etc. But we want to threaten people with this, but we know it's the US who do it. So anyway.
I think this is where the carrot and stick approach that people assumed was embedded in the French initiative, that it was a French-American initiative, not just a French initiative. But let me move back to you, Ishac. Given this very complicated foreign geopolitical and kind of political context, where do you see Lebanon on the economic and financial front? A year ago, almost to the we put out the 10-point plan to avoid the lost decade. Where are we on that plan? Is it still viable? What's the way out?
I think it's still viable, and it's still necessary. The 10 points that we recommend are still very necessary. And none of them have been adopted. I mean, what's striking is that no policy have been taken. The Prime Minister Diab put together a proposal, a plan together with Lazare, which took most of our points on board, and that's the kind of standard way of resolving this kind of crisis. But then there was a very strong pushback from the economic and political elites, and since then nothing has happened. The audit of the central bank has not moved forward. There is no law on capital control, so the rich can still legally get their money out of the country when anyone else with a bank account cannot access their funds. It's really important, I think, in our discussion to bring back the economy, centrally as it should be. The current no strategy is actually a strategy, and it's a strategy of pushing implicitly all those huge losses slowly over time to the middle class, which has to take out some money from their dollar bank accounts in Lebanese pound at a very unfavorable rate, which gets done through printing liras, which devalues the currency and get this money eroded very quickly. It's a way of absorbing the losses that is terribly inefficient. You can calculate kind of back of the envelope that the trap in which Lebanon is now, the kind of path in which it is, basically burns about $1 billion of income per month. It's terribly inefficient. Now, Hezbollah is at the center of everything you're talking about politically, but Hezbollah has a big dilemma. It has external interests, but it also has internal interests. It cannot be happy with its relatively poor constituency bearing the burden of that very inefficient and unfair adjustment that leads nowhere. It can only lead, if it continues this way, to a failed state, to a decade of poverty and misery. And it is at the center in the sense that it has supported this power sharing agreement with On in terms of Christian cover, with Hariri to protect its weapon, with Berri as well. And these are the main beneficiaries of the current regime, of the current political strategy, which basically is about the economic elites unwilling to absorb the losses in some organized ways to get the state creditworthy again. I mean, the state cannot borrow, it can at best print money, and it has a huge deficit, and its employees in real times now earn a third of what they used to earn. It's totally unsustainable. so really the only way to sort this out is for the elites to accept these losses, accept to hit on their wealth so that the state can function again, so that the banking sector is clean and can function again, and Lebanon can start growing like Greece did from a low base, but with a stabilization followed by improvements over time, hopefully a change in economic model. All this would benefit Hezbollah if it knows that it could somewhat protect its core external interest, its weapons, in any form, political form, outside the current power sharing arrangements. And so, you know, all these external developments are very important in pushing it to potentially change strategy. Otherwise, you know, we are moving very fast I think at least what has happened has exposed the fact that there is no state per se in Lebanon. No decisions can be made in this vetocracy. Just in terms of comparison, Ecuador had a debt crisis in March. By June, it had a rescue plan together, and it's already growing back. And here we are in Lebanon a year after, with nothing having been done.
Just on this note, can you perhaps describe a little bit the kind of future scenarios we're looking at of continuing along this path of policy making by no policies through no policy making? I mean, the fact that no action has been taken is in and of itself a policy. As you said, pushing the losses on the middle class and on the poorer classes. Where is this, I mean, the kind of devolution we're looking at? And then from there on, what would be your proposed priorities for the next government, which is supposedly in the making?
Well, I mean, I doubt that the Hariri government would be able to make the tough decisions.
I agree.
That are required to really put the country on a path to recovery. I think there are a few things he can do. He could certainly start on the rehabilitation of Beirut. I mean, there is the feuille de route of Macron that was supposed to be easy things to do for 2-3 months until there is a Paris conference. That probably would become the Hariri plan. And on top of that, is to get organized for rehabilitation of Beirut, with money going directly to the people, very much with civil society, and the World Bank, with the UN, are putting such a vehicle together. So he can focus on this. He can focus on a few other elements, minor elements, important in the long term, such as improving the procurement law and the like. He'll get stuck on the audit of the central bank. There's no way he'll let that move. Even if he would be willing to share his own wealth, since his bank is also at stake, I doubt that the other big actors, big Sunni Christian capital, Amal capital, would trust him to lead a movement that share losses among the big economic elite. So I don't know. I guess the best he could do, if he is really pressed, to go beyond the current, what we have called, and we have warned against in our 10 points plan, the lirification strategy. That strategy of allowing depositors to withdraw money in devalued liras. He could do that if really pressed, he may want to think of doing that on the whole stock of deposits. That would be one way of solving the debt problem.
With catastrophic, even more catastrophic implications for the country and for the,
right. I mean,
what they're doing now anyway, but...
No, if he does it on the whole stock, which is something Argentina did in the past, it's easy to do. So with his ally, the head of the central bank, he could do it without requiring big legislation. It's better than nothing, but of course, it's much worse than a well-organized debt resolution of the type that the IMF would push, which, funny enough, in Lebanon would be much more fair socially than what is happening right now. So he could do that, but it would take a lot of muscle from his part, because the street would rise in anger, clearly, right? So it would take stamina and muscle that I don't think he has. So a priori, I think it's a government that would do little things, but would see the crisis deepen. And the need for an alternative approach would remain. In my mind, the alternative approach is actually what Macron has in mind. The prerequisite for it is to be able to neutralize politics, political issues, tough political issues, such as Hezbollah's weapon, at least for a year or two, so that a technical, let's not call it technocratic, technical cabinet could actually execute an agreement, something agreed by all the political actors, something they cannot do because, as Randa was describing, once they negotiate in economics, then other issues come in and it becomes impossible to reach any decision, which is why Lebanon got into a crisis, into the first case, a crisis we've seen coming over the years. So the Macron strategy would be the right one, at least to solve the short-term issue, the house burning, with a technocratic government, if the international conditions allow to neutralize the Hezbollah and other very hot political issues. Now, this would allow Lebanon to stop the house burning, but not to recover. A longer-term recovery requires many other things for the state to become cleaner, for the rule of law to work, to rebuild infrastructure, to improve the investment climate. All this requires really political change, and that will take time. That requires elections for the opposition to become more credible, to start occupying the political scene, pushing for reform, and becoming a much more dynamic factor, so that we can hope of a long-term recovery. But at the very least, I think a better international environment would at least allow us to not become a failed state. This is really what we need to focus on today. The economics is really collapsing. It's already very bad. Inflation over 100%, as you've said, poverty over 50%, the middle class disappearing, unemployment at about 40%, massive migration, and all that. Lebanon was still using some of its reserves to subsidize basic necessities, drug, food, fuel, and within a few weeks, that will be over. We'll go one step further in terms of collapse. So it is important to keep the economy in mind and to think of how to, at the very least, stop the house burning before we become a bit more ambitious in terms of what can be done.
So what we're looking at today is at least sustained support for a small cabinet of independents, people who are able to undertake some of the decisions that are needed to stabilize the country. And some of these, even the stabilization measures, are incredibly hard decisions, whilst at least freeze the collapse, let's put it this way, whilst there is more sustained work on a medium to long-term recovery plan, which will require also considerable external capital, which is where I turn back to both Randa and to Dorothée. And let me start with you, Dorothée, first, which is what should France, or what can France and the EU do to help in this scenario, and what can they realistically ask of the Lebanese government? And I'll ask you the same, Randa, the same question. What can and should the US in this scenario do? How can they help? Dorothée, we can't hear you.
Yeah. 2 points maybe, and the first point is that I think it's you, Ishac, who wrote that the main priority, the very hot priority, was to try and prevent Lebanon to become a failed state, because once you've collapsed, coming back into capacity takes such an enormous effort, like it's decades of work. And you know, we'd been talking about Lebanon for years as a quasi-failed state that kept on working on some sectors of public work, kept on working. There were areas where the state was still functioning, but there were many areas where it was so degraded that it was a unique case of something intermediary. And then we have this in other places, probably in the Middle East. But what we fear is a failed state with extreme external interference from big players that will not allow even any reconstruction, any rebuilding, any other structure to be built. Like maybe we could say we have in Iraq, of course, like probably Syria is becoming, etc. So I totally agree with you that you have to avoid this situation of a failed state. But I'm absolutely amazed at the fact that nobody was interested in Lebanon anymore. You know, there was like they get no financial support from any Gulf country anymore, so they're lost, etc. But then when the crisis gets hotter politically and geopolitically, then everybody's back, and it becomes completely impossible to disentangle, you know, these geopolitical stakes from the political ones, from the economic ones. So I agree with you that you have to absolutely try and separate the economic reforms and try to focus on the sustainability of economic reforms, etc. Separate it from the political difficulties. But then you have the geopolitics coming to basically ruin all your efforts all the time. So this means probably that a solution will come from a third party, an external monitoring of reforms, but it cannot be done, of course, by one single country. This is why the leadership of France is so ambivalent, because it's being over-criticized, just like American influence in the region. You know, when any player is too exposed, it becomes inefficient and super criticized. So this is where probably the EU may have a role to play, but the EU itself cannot do anything because it doesn't have the capacity to engineer the big pack of technical financial reforms that you have to do in Lebanon. So I see that they should be teaming up probably with the IMF at some point, but then you will have to have maybe the EU or some states or some third states being able to guarantee that the political reforms will be done so that the money can be, you know, liberated, because the IMF up to now doesn't want to commit to anything because they do not trust the political elite in Lebanon to do the reforms. And my second point was, because the first point was that it's external monitoring, and that's a question to Ishac actually. When we discussed Lebanon like 6 months ago, like before the Beirut explosion, before we came to a purely humanitarian situation, actually, which is in fact an opportunity for the EU. You know, this is normally where we are good at. Before that, I thought, okay, we've managed to do this with Greece. I mean, the economic situation in Greece, it has taken time. That we've imposed a period of extremely severe austerity, but it has been externally monitored and very fine-tuning all the time. So could we find a solution with external monitoring for Lebanon? I don't see any other way for these reforms to be implemented. And the second point was about Macron's strategy. I think there's a very important thing about the public relations side of it. Like I said, maybe he's done too much communication, etc. But I think that was part of the strategy, was to expose the situation in Lebanon. And there's one symbolic point that's also very important from a strictly financial point of view, which is the secret bancaire, bank secrecy. You said they will never be able to do the auditing of the central bank. Come on, this is central. This is central not because it's a central bank. But if you don't do that, you never get the money. If you don't have it properly, seriously done, it'll be very difficult. So exposing the small trafficking from within the Lebanese political arena maybe is also part of the strategy. Like the whole world was not necessarily completely acquainted with the subtleties, of the internal clientelism in Lebanon, etc. And I think probably you need to make people accountable up to a certain point before you'll be able to get the trust of the people who have to lend money, because you need money, and money will come from the outside.
But Dorothée, I don't think there's any disagreement of the need for monitoring, external monitoring. Anyway, we can
how
come
do you
back to
do
this.
it? How do you do it? What's the mechanism?
The mechanism for
structure?
it probably will have to be something external and internal at the same time. This is what we've been advocating. But the challenge really is more in terms of what you just mentioned, getting the political elite to agree to a central bank audit, among many other things. Getting the political elite to agree on a burden sharing, a burden sharing of losses between them. These have been the, sorry, Ishac, come in, yeah.
Just one point.
We go back to
my point
sorry,
was
but
just
because
about,
we're
running out of time. My point was
yeah,
just
we're running
about
out of time. We need
transparency.
to
okay.
Sorry.
No, to respond to Dorothée, I think Greece is an excellent model. The Troika there, where the political relations were managed by Europe, and the IMF managed to put together the conditions, the economic, the technocratic part, and the monitoring could work in Lebanon. Where I want to disagree parenthetically is on making the politicians accountable in this first phase. I would, of course, love that, but in reality, I think this is the contradiction in the Macron plan that really contributed to its failure. It's not logical that you want to save the house first while you're actually exposing the key political interest, the key corruption, which is at the heart of Lebanon, but which you could not solve immediately. If you put that in front, nothing will happen. The elite will protect their interest and would let the country burn. I think Macron had this weakness of putting that in to satisfy the street, believing that it will not happen. It's not required for an IMF program. What you need to is account for how much reserves there are, the flows of funds, but not where they come from and which corruption they are hiding. I think that, unfortunately, may have to be left for a second stage.
Thank you, Ishac. Aranda. We can't hear you, Aranda. You need to unmute.
Let me make quickly one controversial comment. I think the worse Lebanon gets, the more likely that it gets higher up on the priority of the next US administration. I hate to say that, but that's the reality, and that's where the EU, France in particular, can come in, and try to offer, ideas, pathways for multilateral work on Lebanon, because that's the only way Lebanon issue is going to be solved, is through a multilateral approach involving the US, involving the EU, involving GCC countries. And right now, there is not a political will for that here, given all the priorities we talked about, but also there are not ideas, in my opinion, on the table from the EU on how to do that. And so the crisis, if it gets worse, it might push this further in terms of priority. I think, building on what you all just said, a colleague of mine and I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs in August, in which we are proposing the establishment of the international community coming together and basically having a compact with Lebanon, but a compact that is unlike what, for example, we did after the war in Afghanistan, after the intervention in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, that is a bit removed from Lebanese jurisdiction because of all the concerns of corruption and the challenge and the demands of the Lebanese citizens. We called it the International Beirut Reconstruction Authority, to be led by an international figure who has been involved in similar efforts following disasters, around the world. And it's based on establishing a compact with the Lebanese government that condition aid on performance. And and there are models, you know, at least within the U.S. administration, we are arguing, or within the U.S. Political system, that can offer a better pathways than what we have done in Iraq and Afghanistan, which did not work well, partly because the international community was not united in standing up to the local authorities when they failed on following on performance. And I think what we need to have is to have this kind of multilateral approach, some creative ideas about how donor assistance could be channeled to conditioning, you know, aid, billions of dollars on performance, but removing whatever we establish as much away as possible from Lebanese government jurisdiction. And that's where the challenge is going to be. I'll stop here.
Randa, just to, and I know Ishac probably will have something to say on this because he and I have discussed this, but there is quite a bit of at least discussion to try and figure out how this can be done. I mean, I have to say that at least on the issue of removing or staying away from Lebanese institutions, there is a real conundrum there because you don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. And while the political leadership is quite corrupt, and while some institutions are horrifically corrupt, there are some functioning institutions that one can work with. So you don't want to bypass state institutions completely, but you want to work with the ones, and this is where I think the role of local syndicates, local organizations, there are plenty of very professional, very, people whose integrity is beyond reproach, who are well known and who are able to take part in an exercise that tries to identify what the elements of that compact is and who would be willing partners on the ground.
Maha,
but again,
Maha,
this is
I think the difficulty is going to be given all we know about how Lebanon, is governed and the corruption, and especially with the increased emphasis of a Biden administration on fighting corruption, is going to be to get any kind of cooperation from the US Senate on this front, if it involves Lebanese government jurisdiction. You know what I mean? So you're right, it's a conundrum for Lebanon, but also it's conundrum for people in the United States, think tankers, even officials who are pushing these ideas. So you have to find some kind of a middle way to to assuage the concerns that are prevalent inside US Congress about the corruption of the Lebanese government.
No, and I mean, it's not unfounded concerns. Yeah. Unfortunately, they're very serious concerns. Yeah. I think you wanted to add something on this particular issue, or not really?
I mean, I think Randa has a point, but there has been worse places where the IMF has intervened and the US has allowed them to intervene. So I don't see the US vetoing really an IMF intervention. Now, the IMF would place the bar quite high before it comes in and will ask for reforms before it can even land. So I don't expect the Hariri government to be able to break through, but he could prepare the ground for the next government. Now, in the meanwhile, where aid is really needed is for the rebuilding of Beirut and is for a safety net to at least keep the roof from collapsing in the meanwhile. And there the World Bank has been working with UN agencies at creating a vehicle which is quite creative. It's kind of following on Macron's populist promise to the people when he was hugging them in the street to bring aid directly to the people. So it's a multi-donor trust fund that works very closely with civil society group in terms of its governance, its execution, and its checks and balances. And society doesn't work directly with government, but involves the good government officials that Maha was talking about at various levels, in the municipality, in particular institutions, to make reforms good for the rebuilding of Beirut. And I feel this instrument could be a great school to involve civil societies much more closely, not just in criticizing, but in trying to implement things together with parts of the administration, in figuring out how you do accountability exercises, how you use transparency to to check that money is spent effectively, that the reform are not just implemented on paper, but actually the cadastre functions better, that you can actually get permits for construction in ways that fit the zoning law and the like. And I'm hoping that this could be a great school that can help us not lose time, but learn how bigger problem can also get resolved.
Okay, thank you all for great answers. I'm going to, since we have well, no, actually we're at the end of the panel. There are a few questions from the audience, some related to the collapse of the Lebanese state. We've already talked about it. There's one question which I think maybe Randa can take, which is could there be real peace in the Middle East without engaging the Palestinians? I think the short answer to that is no. I suspect that Randa and I would agree on this, how. Something about remittances. Yes, the remittances have gone down. But at the same time, I think the one thing we've seen is the remarkable people-to-people support. And I think maybe we'll end the seminar here just on a bit of a positive note, which is what has emerged, particularly in the aftermath of the collapse, but even more visibly in the aftermath of the Beirut explosion, is the tremendous people-to-people solidarity that we have seen between the Lebanese, both those in Lebanon and the diaspora, but also between external, non-Lebanese and the Lebanese. The support has been overwhelming. And I believe that given the state of the countries, the collapse of the country's institutions, many families would not have survived until now. Their homes are being fixed. The situation is still dire, don't get me wrong, but that solidarity has really helped sustain the lives and the livelihoods of countless families in Lebanon. So, and there is a vibrancy on the ground, which we didn't have a chance to talk about today, but which is also quite remarkable. And maybe one last comment on how far things are changing and have changed in the recent university elections that took place at the Lebanese American University, but also the American University in Beirut. The student elections, the resounding win was for independent candidates. Candidates not affiliated with any political parties. And at the American University of Beirut, it's the secular club. So this gives a bit of a flavor in terms of where the youth of the country are going and what their thinking is. And again, holds promise for the future of this country as we muddle our way in that direction. I want to thank you, Randa, Dorothée, and Ishac for a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining us on this panel, and for Paolo and ISPI for great partnership. And I'm sure we'll be connecting again on yet another panel somewhere down the road soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup. See you.